Hi, so welcome back. I'm delighted to see all of you. This is the fifth meeting of members of APSA who are interested in exploring ways that our field might be useful to address the polarization on the world stage. And I think of this as a new kind of group in the sense that it's not a therapy group and it's not a discussion group. I think of it as a kind of new process where people who are different in significant ways, not pathological, but just different, can get to know each other personally, ideologically, and try to be true to ourselves and learn about other people and stay in the room and try to tolerate the uncomfortable feelings that emerge during this process and see where it goes. There's a third dimension, which is the outside world, the people who may or may not watch on YouTube, who would contribute to our, literally and also in our imagination, because they're listening, whoever they are.
Yeah.
It instills a little bit of paranoia, but I think a useful kind of paranoia. And I'm hoping that we can do something that possibly could be replicated, where our field could learn something from exploring ourselves, not just intellectually, theoretically, academically, but how we can get to know each other and what gets in the way of solving problems with others. So with that in mind, I guess I'll share my brief thoughts about what's been happening. I'm not going to go into detail. If anybody's watching it, they want something quick and punchy. Otherwise, they're going to turn off very quickly. So I guess what I'm thinking is that APSA is primarily liberal. At least the people who talk in APSA are primarily liberal. The conservatives are there, but I think they've been afraid to come out out of hiding. So I've been very moved by Michelle and Katrina's willingness to tell us more about your beliefs and your perspectives, and let your institute overhear some of it. I've been very moved by that. And but at the end of the last meeting, where I thought we were, or I agreed with Lynn when you wrote that we were kind of nice to each other and referencing other people, that at the end of the meeting, you wrote an email saying that, and saying that something had happened with you that you had been too anxious to talk about at the meeting. And so you agreed to share that with us. So maybe we could start there and see where it takes us.
Okay. So what I had not shared was the fact that on April 1st, oddly, ironically, humorously, I got arrested. And I got arrested on by choice and as part of a nonviolent stance that I took. I didn't plan to, but I was sitting, as I do during legislative sessions. We're in a red state. 3/4 of the legislators are Republicans and 1/4 are Democrats. And I sit in committee meetings along with my other buddies, and or in the House, watching the House proceedings. And we're not allowed to speak, but we can hold up signs and kind of let our feelings be known in other ways. But and it's a nonviolent group. The group I sit with is called the Nashville Nonviolent Liberation Movement. There are 10 of us. It's a small group. But I had come in late. Usually I sit down on the front row with my other buddies, but I had come in just as the meeting was about to start, the committee meeting. And so I sat in the back, and I didn't intend to get arrested. We didn't have a nonviolent protest planned that day or anything. But as I was sitting in the meeting and hearing yet another committee meeting about this one particular bill that had been pushed, as you may know, if you sit in committee meetings in the state legislatures, they go through, every bill goes through multiple committees. You know, like they'll look at the money angle, they'll look at the any legal issues, judiciary angles, they'll look at, you know, just all kind of angles that this bill might be impacted by. And so I had been sitting through a whole bunch of committee meetings about this one bill, which was designed to penalize the children of undocumented immigrants in K through 12 public education. One version of the bill was to actually make them ineligible to attend school. Another version of the bill was to make them have to pay tuition, which most of the parents would not be able to pay. And so we've been just sitting through committee meetings day after day on this particular bill and other bills as well. And this day, it was actually it was a Senate, in the Senate, not the House, but my particular district senator, who is not a real eloquent speaker or anything. I mean, I like him and I like his positions, but he's not usually someone who just moves me. But he pointed out that this would be a whole generation of children made illiterate at the state's direction. And that just really got to me. Then other people made other arguments and so on in the committee. So when it came time to vote, the Republicans, of course, won the committee vote because they were in the majority. And then we were directed to leave the meeting. So I guess the next group of committees could come, the next committee could come in and meet in that space. And I had just been sitting there. Like I say, I didn't plan to do this, but I just felt like I couldn't go along with yet one more day of hearing these arguments and nothing changing. I just thought, I just can't cooperate with this. So I just sat there. Well, the state troopers came over. They were directed by, you know, the chair of the committee to come over and get me to leave. And they were very nice. They were a very nice group of men. And they talked to me and they said, you know, please leave, please come. I mean, they're really nice. They, please come, you know. And I said, I just can't do it. And then they said, well, you know, we'll have to arrest you if you won't get up. And I said, well, that's okay. And I meant that. I mean, I felt very much at peace and very calm and very much myself. I did not feel like this was a strain at all. And I did not feel any conflict about it or anything. I just thought, I just can't go along with this. So sure enough, they did arrest me. They carried me out and carried me to the trooper's car and took me to the jail, and I was booked and all that. So that's basically what happened. And I didn't really discuss it with the group. And when Alice had asked me this time, you know, to talk about it a little bit, I was thinking, well, what exactly happened that made me think that I wouldn't tell our group about this? And what I think is really the nuts and bolts of it is, I didn't think there was a way to tell it without going into the detail that I've just gone into. And I wasn't sure that the group would be up for hearing kind of a lengthy story about my inner life, you know, and what I was thinking and feeling while all that was going on. So that's why I didn't mention it, I think. And so it wasn't so much, at first I thought that maybe I was feeling like the group would be judgmental about it, but I'm not sure that that's really what I was thinking. I think it was more that it would take the group in a different direction, and maybe that was the direction people didn't want to go in. I think maybe that might have been more my hesitation. So, because I didn't want to tell it without saying, hey, here's what my thoughts and feelings were at the time, because that was the interesting part to me. I mean, it was a very significant moment for me to do that without any fear, without any real emotion, you know, just kind of like, well, here I am, and this is what I'm going to do. But I wasn't sure people would be all that interested or want to get drawn into that kind of discussion. But yeah, it was an important thing for me. I mean, you know, it's had repercussions and so on ever since it happened, it led to some additional protests in the state legislature, and that bill did not pass at this past legislative session. And I think part of that was because there were so many protests that were engendered by that step that I took. So it was an important thing for me. But anyway, but at the same time, I kind of felt like, well, I'm really withholding something from the group because, it was a significant thing that happened and I didn't talk about it. So I had mixed feelings that way, I guess, too. So that's pretty much, I've told you now what I think catches you up on it.
What an inspiring story.
Oh, thanks.
I was just thinking how we are having these discussions at a time of what I truly agree is a time of really terrible injustices and unconstitutional acts, and I think it's really so awful, like and you taking such a position, putting your own body on the line in that way, and then it leading somewhere. I mean, it's very inspiring.
Thanks. My daughter, her business is public relations, and she said that she thought that it had an impact. I mean, it was on Rachel Maddow twice, and a whole lot of news programs and so on. She said she thought it had an impact because it was an elderly person, me, on one end, and a child, K through 12 children education issues on the other end. And that combination of children and elderly people kind of made it more touching or more impactful. I wouldn't have thought of that, but she thought of it from her PR angle,
There are times when using yourself as an instrument has to be acted out, embodied, that just talking, we shouldn't do that, tisk tisk. Here's an article that says how we shouldn't do that. It doesn't work nearly as well as an elderly person talking about young children who will be illiterate, and people writing stories about that. Making yourself a transference figure,
Right.
in a sense. Let them talk about you rather than about how to treat immigrants.
Yeah, and I am a true introvert. I mean, I am really an introvert. So this did get attention, and that's really was uncomfortable to me. So that was another piece of it. At the same time, when it does go to trial, which will be in August, I said to my lawyer the other day, well, what I want is for this court hearing, whenever it happens, I don't care what the outcome is, but I want it to be able to be used for the purposes of the issue that I was, concerned about. And he said, oh, okay. So he was okay with that. But, and it's true that's what I would like. I mean, I'm in a position I could go to jail for a little while or something that, I don't have kids at home. I don't have a job. I mean, I could do that. But, it was, and that's the point. Whenever you do a nonviolent action, you want it to have a meaning. You want it to have a purpose. You don't want it to just be one and done and not have any, usefulness. So that's part of that. But that goes against my introverted rather do things quietly kind of personality. So, but I think it's interesting. I like Jack and Cameron both saying, "Oh, that was a good story. That's an inspiring story," or something. You know, that's interesting to me to hear you say that. That's I don't know what impact I thought my telling that would have on the group, but you know, it feels good for somebody to say, "Good job, Lynn." You know, that feels good. At the same time, I think, well, what does that do to our group dialogue here? What does that do to this conversation? And I would be interested to explore that some more.
Well, there's so many levels to that, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is how do people change, or how does social change happen? How do people's minds get changed? You know, so the question of ways in which we can have influence on other people in a way that they can kind of integrate and digest. And also, as I was, thinking between the last meeting, hearing that you hadn't shared it, I was wondering, okay, what is the issue? So we could unpack that and say, does everybody agree with the underlying issue that you were on board with?
Mhm.
In addition, and I certainly agree with it, but I'm not sure everybody else does. So, and then also the idea of, an analyst in jail, it's like a wonderful idea. You can imagine the conversations you would have with the other people.
Funny, yeah.
Yeah, there's the action and the content.
Mhm.
Behavior is pretty cool. I think it communicates a lot, but then there's the question of what you are actually communicating about immigrants in a
And one other piece of this, I was thinking about, well, if we were having this conversation on the listserv, it probably would have a very different impact than the fact that we can see each other, versus if we were in person, we haven't even met each other. So the levels of where dialogue can actually happen seems very relevant in this process that we're exploring, in comparison to what's going on in the APSA listserv, where now there's a separate listserv for things that may not be directly related, just kind of keep the politics on a separate place, and that's created its own controversy.
Yeah.
Well, I feel that I feel a pressure kind of on the group that we all kind of collapse into a single line that Lynn is absolutely right. And of course, we all agree on all the aspects of the political issue because we're all good people. We're all the right kind of people. We're not like those 45% of the people that, for some reason, seem to be supporting this. And also that's one thing. And the other thing is like, well, what are we even doing here? Why are we even trying to talk about ways to open dialogue between different points of view? Because obviously we live at a time where there's much more important things happening. We really need to all be doing what Lynn did and standing in protest as opposed to trying to have dialogue with people who are so wrong about everything. So I just hear those lines of thinking in the back of my head. Not that I agree with them, but
Well, I guess I had a couple thoughts. Lynn, I was thinking about what you said in the email after our last meeting, that we were all kind of agreeable and maybe being polite with one another. I was thinking after that I don't always feel like fighting, and that there is a lot to be said, I think, for being agreeable and finding some consensus. I think it can be a difficult position to sort of be the contrarian voice. So there's that piece that I was thinking about and reflecting on. In terms of you staying in the room and your arrest, I will say I admire the strength of your convictions. I do think that, you know, if there's interest in the group, it does seem like there's more to talk about, you know, when it comes to the issue. You know, for instance, I'll say that I don't think children should be punished. Of course, that isn't right and that isn't fair. But I've sort of become weary, you know, of some of these euphemisms, such as the word undocumented, to describe people who are here illegally or in our country illegally.
Who do a lot of the work that a lot of us don't want to be able to do.
Well, but that's a way of saying that they're essentially slave labor. I think more Americans would do those jobs if the working conditions were better and the pay was better. You know, essentially allowing streams of illegal immigrants into this country only benefits massive corporations, and it depresses the working class wages and standard of living.
So then the question would be, how likely is it that these huge corporations that are taking advantage of the cheap labor would actually improve the working conditions and raise the salaries?
Well, right now, there's no incentive to do so. You know, as long as the left is, you know, is kind of on this bandwagon of ever more unlimited migration of sort of celebrating open borders, there's no pressure on the corporations. There's no incentive, and in fact, we're only seeing that pressure quite recently.
So this is an interesting moment in terms of like, how much do we unpack and explore this conversation, which would be quite interesting, because I think there's a mischaracterization probably on both sides of what left wants, you know, versus, you know, but I'm not sure that's the best, I'm not sure that's the best use of the group time.
Well, I certainly don't feel an expert on these issues. One of the things is, as things have gotten more, you know, so many different things happening, I'm aware of how little I know and how I could not even speak on either end intelligently. I know, you know, it's how you start to learn more and you realize how little you know. And what bothers me is that all these talking heads talk as if they have the answers to all sorts of things. And and this is a psychoanalytic concept that we have trouble dealing with not knowing. People can't stand the unknown. And we are really walking into the unknown, like everything is being broken down. We don't know what's going to happen next. And it's terrifying. And I think rather than admitting our own terror and fear, there's a lot of blaming of the other side. So that is the idea of some kind of dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And just even making the attempt, knowing we're on different sides, we're all here together, we're talking to each other, you know, we're trying to be reasonable.
I've certainly found that I've learned an enormous amount from my conservative friends, my MAGA friends, Trump supporter friends, who in New York, you know, initially they were met with horror. You know, how you know the feelings about Trump in New York is just like nothing good to say about him. But just questions like, you know, I didn't picture the, you know, immigration as this thing where lots of people are coming in and taking, you know, what we have to offer, and you know, working for low wages and getting benefits in exchange, and some becoming citizens or getting green cards and others not. And I've had a bunch of patients marry for green cards. You know, it's thing that happens in New York. And it just sort of raised my consciousness about the complexity of these issues.
Mm.
And, you know, who gets Medicaid and who doesn't, who deserves it, who doesn't, who's, you know, where's the money coming from? All of those things were just sort of part of the routine of my daily living. And it didn't rise to the level of, is this right or wrong or good or bad? And until recently. And I'm glad for that. And I do think that if people could stop, you know, attacking the other and rooting for our team, that we could actually find solutions that do, at least in large part, you know, honor the needs and differences of different people. And, you know, it just doesn't seem that hard to find a creative solution, but we seem unable to do that because it's all good or all bad.
And it's so charged that everybody is afraid. You can't speak freely when you're afraid.
You can't.
I think a lot of people think there would have been a way for the Trump administration to tighten the immigration rules beyond what the Biden administration had, and it could have been done a certain way. They're not doing it that way. They're doing it in a very intense and controversial way, and you know, fire and fury kind of thing. And there was a place for a compromise, but they thought this was, you know, this is what Stephen Miller wanted, was a full-throated assault and to making a point. I mean, what is the point? I feel like the point is like, don't mess with real Americans. Like, we've been quiet too long, putting up with all this junk, and we don't like immigrants. But I mean, I think most people do like immigrants. Most people like living in a multicultural world, like where there's a good, you know, I love food, so I know it's kind of offensive to always talk about food when you talk about different ethnicities. But I mean, you have interesting restaurants and interesting neighborhoods and interesting people, and we all grow and learn. But there is a way to do it where you're making people comfortable in there. I mean, there were people who were here first, and they should have some say what the rules are and not just be talked down to. They're like, well, you have to accept what people in New York City think. And it's the end of that my line of thought.
But I think splitting and othering has become an essential part of politics, because there was a bipartisan immigration bill that would have made significant change that Trump said not to pass in order to allow this very extreme dynamic, because that seems people feel comfortable when there's an other. So I think part of this conversation is just to notice that sort of tense, what is the value of having an other?
But the Biden administration stepped into it by not having good immigration laws that made sense, that were enforced. And because the Biden administration, much like, I don't know, APSA, is beholden to the most left, most coastal sides of opinion, and his advisors were telling him, well, you know, you're being a racist if you try to have anything more robust. And look where we are now. This was preventable. This was foreseeable. We knew who Trump was and how he likes to come up with straw men, and he wants powder kegs that he can blow up and seize power. And we were blinded because of our good liberal, not wanting to hurt anyone's feelings, that stuff we do.
I agree. I think the incapacity to have these nuanced conversation just messes everybody from all directions. And that's theoretically the capacity of psychoanalysts to sit in that place of not knowing, to hold the space, to have the deep conversations. That's the uncomfortable space that people find inaccessible.
this sounds crazy, but in a way, I think if Trump is doing the same thing that Lynn did, sort of taking a position and not budging, and having everybody say, you're good, you're bad, you're right, you're wrong, you're breaking the law, and saying, yeah, okay.
Mhm.
The law needs to be broken, and I'm here to communicate something by my physical presence and my behavior that is not working when it's said in a nice.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Lynn, you need to create a mugshot t-shirts.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I can see that.
Alice, that's such a good point, that certain kinds of law breaking are deemed acceptable, whereas others are not, such as you pointed out, what Trump is doing in some ways.
Yeah, Reverend William Barber's been arrested several times in the U.S. Capitol building recently for praying. I guess it's against the rules to hold any kind of gathering in the Capitol Rotunda. And he's had at least 3 arrests that I've seen on the news, praying with other clergy for, I think, the bill that's before the Congress now, praying that it would be challenged. And so he's been arrested, and yeah, so that's okay. I mean, most people don't complain about his being arrested, because he's a well-known, well-respected minister. So that's an interesting point. Some people can be arrested and it's considered honorable, like when Dr. King was arrested multiple times. Some people said, well, good, he deserves it, and many people said, this was a part of the movement that led to people considering the laws against which he was protesting and getting arrested for. Jim Crow laws back in the day. So yeah, people have different opinions about that. And everybody was real nice to me. I mean, there might have been people. Okay, so my husband's sister, she's a good old Southern woman, and she says, I'm not racist, but this is all about heritage. This is important to me, about heritage. And she's probably on the Republican end. Her husband's a very liberal Democrat, and my husband, who's now deceased, and I both liberal on that end. But when I got arrested, Rochelle called me and she said, my husband's name was Newell. She said, Newell would have been proud of you. And I said, yeah, you're right, he would have been. And I was just really touched by the fact that Rochelle could say to me, my brother, your husband, would be proud of you for doing this. And he would have been. That would have been exactly down his alley. So for Rochelle to say that, rather than say, well, we're Southern women and we don't do this. I appreciated the fact that she said what she did say instead of what she could have said, given where she's coming from, which is that, Southern women don't go out and get themselves arrested, that kind of thing. But I thought that was really empathic of her to see that I would be appreciative of her commenting that her brother would have been proud of my doing that. I thought she stepped outside her comfort zone to say that, really. That also leads me to think about the very personal level of all of this. I mean, I know Michelle, I know Katrina, I know you well enough to know that you're probably not on the same spectrum exactly, you know. And
See myself on a
that
side.
you're, huh?
I don't see myself on a side anymore. I see the world is really broken. And I don't see myself as on sides. Like you know, I was so I was like addicted to reading all this stuff, and now I'm exhausted by it. What I do know, though, it is hard to talk about these controversial subjects when they come up, you know. So that's the problem. Because you know why? People take sides with me a lot of the times. I'm not trying to have an argument. I'm trying to like look for some kind of peace and connection with people despite difference. Like maybe that's too much to ask, but you know, there'll be, you know, I run these groups for people with pain. So a lot of people talk, and some people are just so angry, and I have to kind of shut it down and say, you know, we're from different parts of the country and we're different views, and we want to make this available for everybody. But the last group, somebody would actually raise the question really in a way. It didn't, I'm not good at this, but she raised the question of, you know, I have friends that are Ukrainian, I have friends that are Jewish, I have friends that are Russian, I have friends that are Palestinian, and we just can't talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And so I'm new at this, and I'm not good handling this terrain, and I know I'm not good. And when I'm not sure about something, I tend not to. And in this group, there happened to be another Orthodox woman on, and she's relatively new to the group. And then they started attacking Israel, and they started attacking Netanyahu, and I just felt like so helpless at that point, and I didn't know what to say or what not to say, and it was really a powder keg. And then everybody was talking, and I was just holding it. And so the Orthodox woman said, because they were saying, oh, you know, Netanyahu's 89 or whatever it is. And I saw that she was trying to say something. When I said, so-and-so would like to say something, she goes, for the record, Netanyahu's 75. And it stopped, whatever. I don't even know why or how it stopped, but then it became a rich group and people were able to talk to each other. I don't think it works in a way that we can predict. And I think my difficulty tolerating it and staying with it and being a group leader is, you know, very, very challenging. So I don't feel myself on a side anymore. I feel like we're all in trouble.
We're all in trouble. Yeah.
We are. I mean, at this point, we're in this horrible, broken situation. But people are still just, to me, I have limited strength, and I can't spend it yelling at people. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help other people either.
Well, I mean, it's interesting in your group, helping people with pain, is that's what they shared. Below all the political differences, there's that common thread that there's pain in it from all the different angles.
Much difficult pain to solve than physical pain. Mm-hmm. This is pain, and I think this is about pain. Nobody knows how to work with pain. Mm-hmm. Really, you know, I'm on the mental health. If there's somebody with a physical pain, I was in some group with neurologists, and they go, well, you know, it's an emotional thing. And it can be. That's the thing, it can be. But for those of us, meaning myself, people who can't seem to solve the pain problem, no, it isn't psychological. And, you know, there isn't much help for it. And it's a very, very, I think, though, it has opened me to be less upset about other things since I have to deal with this all the time, kind of. I mean, I wouldn't recommend this to anybody because it's really hard to live with this degree of pain, but it does help you to realize what you can change, what you can't. And connecting with people is the best antidote to pain. And we need that. We forget about this, but we are disconnected from one. You know, people are so disconnected and so angry.
Yeah, it's getting worse and worse for our children. They're between what's going on in the social media and politics and you know the pandemic and school shootings and I don't know what, but there's no moral compass. There's no they don't have anything solid to organize growing up. And it also makes me think about the epidemic of cutting and suicide and acting out physically, viscerally. If that in some way makes people feel more alive, and if war and the fighting that we do is somehow analogous to that, that it's easier to feel alive if I can attack you in some kind of way, or vote for somebody who's going to, get somebody else to go and drop a bomb on somebody else, and I can root for my team. There's something about that physical act of aggression against the self or against others. We don't get upset. We breathe. We won. We nuked Iran. Yay. This kind of conversation, when I try to have conversations with people who are on one side or the other, I can't ask a question without the assumption being that my question was a statement.
Yeah, exactly.
Why is this happening? What do you mean this is happening? How dare you think this is happening? You must be one of those. And then I have to do damage control for the whole conversation. It's not worth it.
It's too exhausting. They're exhausted. I'm exhausted. I find the hate is just, nobody really wants to learn. They want to get you with people, whatever side it is, they want to make sure that you're as nasty and mean and, belligerent to make your point. And you know what? That does not work. It doesn't work. I mean, this is what we all know as clinicians. It certainly doesn't work. It's like we're in a giant power struggle between the left and the right, or whatever you want to call it. But what it is a lot of noise and nothing is happening. It's not working. It's not leading us to understanding, because people aren't interested in understanding. People are more interested in being right.
I find myself thinking about APSA as some analogy between what's happened at APSA during the course of my career and what's happening in our country. When I started, it was a very insular group of almost entirely, white Jewish atheist men. And little by little, other people entered. I was one of the first women, the young pregnant Catholic woman in that world. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, is that I've struggled with that for my whole career. But then there was always this standards, the structure. These are the rules. You have to follow the rules, otherwise you're not analyzable and you should be gone. And it was very much like a religion or a country with, rules that had to be followed or you would be expelled from the kingdom. And then little by little, that started coming apart. The relational models came in, the other theorists came in, there was a lawsuit. And the only way they allowed people other than MDs to become analysts was after a lawsuit by psychologists that was settled by saying, okay, social workers and psychologists can do this, but they weren't thrilled about it. And now we have the nurse practitioners and the people from different arenas, psychotherapy programs, they're all part of APSA, and it feels like the US melting pot, but it also feels like it feels different. There's something missing. We lost something about our theory, something about, and I'm not sure what holds us together anymore.
I think that's true. Well, we were fighting about theories in the beginning to establish something, and now we're in a different stage of.
Yeah, it has that, your religion is as good as my religion. If you're Kohutian and you're Kleinian and you're Lacanian and you're okay, but we don't have a shared discourse. We don't. I have a feeling that our field is losing its center of gravity and it's less potent.
I agree.
I-
Well, Alice, I mean, you saying that makes me wonder if what has happened in absence, continuing to happen, is the psychoanalytic version of the Reformation,
hmm.
where the religion, the ideology, gets splintered into 1,000 little pieces. It's like just throwing a glass bottle, at the wall and watching it shatter. And at that point, yeah, I think that there's not a whole lot that's holding the organization together. Just like in the Western world, the church has lost control. And we're living in the aftermath of that.
True. I feel like I'm in search of a theory that could bring us together without sending people away. It's not white supremacy or Freudian supremacy or religious supremacy. It's something else.
It's something about balance. I don't know, but we're out of balance. We're a reasonable enough homeostasis or whatever it is to have some real norm, so-called, I don't even know what to call it.
Mm.
But I've noticed, because I teach and the students aren't so, one of the things that's very important is to create safety, so I pretty good about doing that, but the discussions I've noticed haven't been as rich. Intelligent candidates, but I don't know if they're comfortable with each other, even because, I don't know if this is another problem of the fact that people can't talk to each other, that people in classes aren't as free to play with the material and to get out of their own way, so to speak. That's a concern of mine in terms of psychoanalytic education.
A lot of energy on figuring out what's offensive about things that were written 100 years ago than there is an understanding what what is the gold mixed with the rock, or sifting out what was the brilliant idea that sort of was discovered in 1910.
Sure.
Instead it's policing language.
Makes it hard for people to feel free enough to talk about their insides, which is hard enough to begin with.
And then when you do happen to get a white, like me, a fairly moderate white Southern psychiatrist in there, and maybe I could stand in for like, well, why are so many white Americans making all these terrible political decisions? And I mean, my experience in analytic classes many times was that I was being unfairly blamed for all kinds of things and made to feel terrible, which I could, I mean, to a point I could take it, but at a point it became very unfair. And at a point it also became like, well, if this is happening to me and I'm sort of half willing to like go with it, like most people aren't as introspective or as patient as I am. And most people, if they're having fingers wagged at them all the time, telling them they should apologize over and over for who they are or what they think.
Mm-hmm.
What mass of people is going to want to do that? I mean, I don't think that's what I don't think that's what Martin Luther King made the South do in the 60s and 70s, to
No.
just over backwards, falling on their own sword, just compulsively apologizing all the time. But we made tremendous progress in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And now it seems like we're going the opposite direction of progress. But I did feel like my analytic training, I have been kind of like an experimental subject of sort of a moderate Southern white person who's being like having their buttons pressed to see what'll happen.
It does feel like using analytic ideas, but in a weaponizing kind of way.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
That's a microaggression.
Oh, boy, that is a good one, Alice.
Yeah.
It's not even so micro.
Don't think like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, when we're working with our patients, clients, Allisons, I don't even know what to call people anymore. You know, he, she, they. You know, if somebody said something that you experience as aggressive, we would work with it. Respond in a way that they could hear, have a dialogue going to see, you know, where the aggression came from, if it was there, if you're misunderstanding something, if you're traumatized by something, you honor it without saying, you traumatized me. You know, that's re-traumatizing. But we tend to move in opposite corners and use analytic language in the totally wrong way to push people away rather than invite them in and that empathy. I think we as a community could do something about that. Just, I mean, words like dialogue, it doesn't mean anything because it's thrown around like sort of too vanilla and too meaningless. But somehow, if we could find a potent way to say some of these things to catch the attention of others, I don't know. I've been doing that in my old age, like on TikTok. I literally do TikTok videos every day. Just little bits and pieces of this.
So are you saying that there's a significant component of ideology now that enters the training and that it's kind of unanalyzable?
Yeah, it's kind of like I'm not really sure what field it is. It's like cultural anthropology or political activism or colonialism. There's a lot of power stuff, and it's just like
talk to you.
I have to step away for 1 second, excuse me.
there's a lot of social justice activism.
Can you call during 30 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
So Cameron, I certainly agree that there's a lot of social justice activism, and I very much agreed with your earlier point that it seems like candidates read articles these days just to find what's wrong or offensive, you know, about how a prior generation might have thought about, you know, human nature and human pathology. But I guess I'm thinking about the social justice activism and kind of wondering, well, what is that about? What does that mean? And I think, like much of leftism, it's an attempt to realize a utopia on Earth. It has at its core, I think, the same kind of goal as the Communist Project did. And we all know how that ended. Or has not necessarily ended, but where that leads to.
But there seems, I mean, I think I agree with you, but I think I think it's worth examining what is the impulse to have a utopian Earth, or at least a good enough Earth. You know, so the process of healing, the process of analysis and understanding is essentially about some level of improvement of one's state. Now, it might be an unrealistic goal, but somehow to sort of, there's a temptation to sort of dismiss the whole thing as unrealistic, just in the same way that there's a way to dismiss a kind of perfect control of everyone through a authoritarian structure is another extreme that's not, in some ways is unempathetic. I'm just trying to come up with a sort of a more psychological metaphor for what the urge is as a way to look at it from that perspective. To not allow itself to be politicized, in other words.
Well, fair enough, Jack. Yeah, I mean, the point about dismissing the whole project, I don't think it's wise to do that, and certainly that there have been, like the push to end slavery, did make life better on this earth, for an entire group of people, to end Jim Crow, likewise. Obviously, there are things we can do that improve, well-being and quality of life and liberty and so forth for a lot of people. But I think that the more that this project continues, I think that it's sort of the urge to realize a utopia on Earth has to do with a lack of belief in the afterlife. I think has to do fundamentally with atheism. If people think this is all there is, it's just this existence, then I think that there's a real, kind of compulsive tendency to try to make it perfect. Whereas I think most religions have functioned like this, is that when there's a belief in the afterlife, this isn't the end. We can try to do the best on this earth, struggle with the challenges, try to make do with the limits and boundaries that are inherently there, the limits of nature, for instance, because we know we're going somewhere better. But when you don't think you're going somewhere better, I think that there's much more of a tendency to struggle against the limits of nature.
So thank you for sharing that, because that's a huge, that opens a huge difference in terms of the way people perceive their lives. And just that definition alone, the old song, "There'll be pie in the sky when you die," it goes way back, so having that frame makes a huge difference in terms of how one sees capacity in life. And we could spend the whole time unpacking the difference of how one would pursue one's life with that difference.
Yeah, and I think that a whole lot of the things we say have that hidden dimension that we don't ever articulate, like Katrina just said it out loud. But
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of my favorite people is this guy, a Southern Baptist minister from Nashville named Will Campbell. He died a few years ago. And what he said all the time was, "We're all bastards, but God loves us anyway." And I just thought that really said a lot. He was a big civil rights leader back in the day. And the older I get, okay, so Dr. King, he believed that in his essay, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, he talked about his own life journey to nonviolence and from really from boyhood to his present when he wrote the essay. Talked about the different steps he went through to reach where he was at that point. And one of the things he talked about was when he was studying theology, and some theologians kind of basically thought that mankind was basically good, and it was just things that happened that made them turn to evil or wickedness. He and I didn't know this till I read this essay a couple of years ago. Dr. King really did believe that we humans were a real mixture. We had the capacity for goodness, and we had the capacity for being just, real jerks. And that was just our human nature. And so he preferred theologians who acknowledged that and recognized that, and didn't try to sugarcoat it, because he thought it was really important to recognize that all of us have this capacity to, do bad things. And I guess in my younger years, I had the idea that we were basically good and just that things happened to us that turned us, But as I've gotten older, I've gotten to have more of Dr. King's attitude that we basically, our human nature is we have a real potential to do, shitty things and as well as good things. And that's just who we are. That's our human nature. And it's kind of makes me much more tolerant, I think, to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that in myself too. And to think whenever I start feeling really judgmental about so-and-so, to first look at myself, that's been helpful to me. So I'm not somebody who looks to the afterlife, although I think probably there are more people on this earth who, believe in multiple existences and reincarnation and so on. There are more people who believe in that than don't. If you think about how many folks are, Hindus, how many folks are Buddhists, how many folks are Christian, whatever, and that's not particularly an issue for me. But it is an issue for me to say, how can I do better and be better at the same time acknowledging that, hey, I'm stuck with this human nature for what it is,
Yeah.
Very true.
Mhm. We are all stuck with human nature.
Right.
One of the things that I think is missing in humans doing what humans do is a genuine creativity. If you saw my Facebook post, I was talking about how we are so creative in the arenas of science and technology. Somebody discovered gravity a few hundred years ago, and then a few guys built a flying machine, and now we're headed to Mars.
Yeah.
We can do that. The germ theory, antibiotics, COVID vaccine 5 minutes later. We trust that we can do that. Somehow, with more human questions, who owns the Middle East? Whose God is more godly than whose other God?
Right.
We tend to sort of roll our eyes and dismiss those questions or answer them in some stupidly literal way, and not trust that we can explore those questions the way we explore other kinds of questions and actually come up with some new solutions, new questions, new ways of thinking about something. I'm not sure why we seem incapable of doing that.
Yeah, that's really the question, isn't it? Well, that's really your question for sure.
My question. My question.
Yeah.
One of the problems, though, is the media, just distorts things. And so we don't even know what we're hearing. I don't trust anything I hear on this. So we're, and also I think that we're so advanced with education and science and all these things, but human nature, what happens is we think we can do anything. We can fly here, but the pandemic happened at a time where people felt they could do anything. I could go here for the day. I could go this, I can do that. Everything is is so available. And then, no, we can't do everything. There are, and we are our worst enemies. Can be, not. We have to
everything, but we can do something.
I think an awareness of the darker side and realizing that and rather than calling the darker side the right or the left, we have all of it. We have all sorts of stuff we don't like in us
ourselves. Yeah.
And talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's so partisan now. When somebody is yelling at me, somebody was yelling. It was something, and it was a person who was actually. This is so crazy because it was somebody who was actually doing something very helpful to me, very kind. got on the phone and started off with something political. And I just was like, I wasn't ready for that conversation. And it was such a weird thing because here I know she cares about me. She took time out of her day to call me to see how I was doing. But I don't think people can get out of their own ways because this is so upsetting. It's so emotional. It isn't, we talk about issues, but it seems like it's the emotion first rather than really being able to, flesh these out and understand what's really going on in an intelligent way because we don't have the information.
Hmm.
So what is the impulse that you think causes us to make such quick assumptions and judgments rather than slowing down?
I think threats to our identity
Yeah.
are they're threats, and we need to find some physical or psychological trick to ward it off the person who's saying something that if we took it in, we might have to question ourselves. And then we would lose something about what organizes us and gives us meaning and purpose. And it seems like that's intolerable.
So that implies maybe the more comfortable and clear we are about our identity, maybe the less defensive we are, with a more capacity to take in the other, or that it doesn't have to be so defended.
Yeah. I mean, when I started doing this, I allowed myself to take in what my conservative Trump supporting friends were saying. And lo and behold, they were saying important stuff.
Yeah.
We
need a two-party system. We need to have a check and balance against different kinds of things under normal circumstances. That the idea that it's an echo chamber of one way of thinking is not good democracy either.
One side which is convinced that it is only the good side of humanity and not the other side, and the other side is only the dark side of humanity.
And then the other side thinks that they're the good side, and the other side is the dark.
Both think the same thing. The other people are out of their minds. Both sides think that. I was thinking about what Katrina said about losing faith in the afterlife and God and things, and I have a different kind of overlapping perspective, but not really. To me, religious belief has never been central to my life, but I think there are other kind of stand-ins for religious life that are also under great threat. So many things, like the things that I find most meaningful and valuable in my life, I feel are all under threat constantly, and they are the kinds of things having to do with changing times and losing things, losing cultural, important cultural things, kind of going away. And I think of how could Trump happen? I think a lot of Americans feel that way about America, that America is an endangered country. There aren't nearly as many of us as there are people who want to come in, and it's going to get diluted and changed beyond recognition. And when what we have is changed and lost beyond recognition, instead of being allowed to grieve that, we're being told that we were wrong-headed in the first place to ever believe in it to begin with. And like having it's not just that, like in New Orleans where I'm from, first the Confederate statues were taken down, which is fine. In a majority black city, I think that makes total sense. But and maybe beyond that, take them down. I'm okay with that. But a lot of people weren't. A lot of people thought, well, these statues were here for 150 years. That's the history of our city, and these were our ancestors, and they mean something to us. but I mean, what I agree to disagree there. But then I went to Ben Franklin High School, which is one of the best high schools in the country, public high school in New Orleans. Then there was this big thing to change the name of Ben Franklin High School, and they choose a name of a black woman she was a genius. She did brilliant mathematics for NASA in the 50s. And it was just wonderful. It was just amazing. But I don't know, Ben Franklin High School had been there for 50 years. It's just this constant, we're going to lose whatever America we knew, and we're not supposed to feel sad about it. And that's kind of like a loss of immortality or a loss of God, like these shared pillars of who we are, what we are, where we came from, where we're going.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really good, Cameron. Thank you for saying that. I really get that. And I have the same thing about being Southern. I mean, I am a real Southern person. I love the South. I love everything about the South, except, the certain things that I don't love about the South. But it has put me in a position of having to, well, maybe have a conflict, I guess you would say, to use one of Alice's terms. She talks about her early training was, conflict and defense and so on. So yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I can listen to country music, I can read Faulkner, I can, just do all this stuff and just melt into it. I love it. I love it. I love Southern poetry. I love Southern novels. I love Southern everything. And yet I can't love the things that are so wicked, what Reverend Lawson called forces of spiritual wickedness that are in the South, and so that puts me in a pickle.
Yeah.
I mean, in another time, in another day, my career, I probably would have been a Southern writer. That's probably the direction I might have gone in my life. That won't, I mean, that never happened and wouldn't happen now. But the reason it wouldn't happen is that I couldn't come to peace with some of the other things that were in this.
But isn't that what we're talking about also, even with ourselves, with our dark side and, getting, because I'm thinking about this, and all of the vitriol on the listserv for APSA was about what position you took, like they're saying, this is the problem here. And no, you've got it wrong. But I think that's not where our expertise lies. I mean, we're not experts on domestic or foreign policy. That's not really what we offer in terms of, we do offer the idea of we understand about projecting and getting rid of stuff we don't like and how hard it is. And Cameron's idea that we haven't had any time to mourn. Yeah. And I think that's what we need. But it isn't, the sad part about this, it has really destroyed institutions all over the place. And, I know a lot of the institutes are suffering because, but people don't really talk about that. I mean, I was at a meeting and I brought up, I think that, there isn't the sense of unity in the institute. I don't know, I don't know. It wasn't like unity. It wasn't like everybody has to be the same, but everybody is part of a same institute. We're like a family. Everybody is different. They have different things. And that's what that kind of diversity is what makes life meaningful. And this is, I don't think that we have anything more to say about politics than anybody else. Being an animal does not offer us special whatever.
Right.
But we do have an understanding of the human mind and how everybody's like flailing all around.
Tuesday night, I went with some buddies to Fisk, which is the university here in town. Fisk Jubilee Singers. John Lewis went to Fisk. Coy Booker's mother went to Fisk. Nikki Giovanni went to Fisk. I mean, it's a wonderful school. And the point of the meeting was some folks had made a documentary about Jefferson Street, which was the old creative street in the black side of town back in the day. And it was a really creative. I mean, if you were a musician, you wanted to play on Jefferson Street. It was really something. And when they built I-40, I think this happened all over the country with different interstates. When they built I-40, they cut right through the part of town that divided blacks from whites, and they destroyed Jefferson Street and tore down all the houses and also cut off the black part of town from the white part of town. And that became a real big issue. And it's only just now being turned around a little bit. So the meeting was to look at the documentary, and then people talked about it. And the place was filled with old residents of Jefferson Street. And I just could have stayed there all night. I mean, they started talking about, do you remember this theater? Do you remember this dry cleaners? Do you remember this place where you could buy a cherry Coke? Their memories, it was just heartbreaking to hear. It was also wonderful to hear. People went from being kind of quiet and, being passive watchers of the documentary to being people who just came alive, remembering, do you remember Miss So-and-so's house? And, there is such a need for this storytelling. So they had to close out about 8 p.m. because people were supposed to come in, clean up the room, and go home. It was in Jubilee Hall, and since they had to clean up the room and close the building for the night. People did not want to leave. They just hung out in the lobby. They just couldn't go. And then they got outside and they hung out on the porch. It was just like, I have another story to tell you. It was just amazing.
Community.
Yeah.
That's what we need, is community. We've lost our community. And we need a community. I mean, human beings need each other.
Yeah. But it was so funny how how they came alive from sitting quietly to just, I couldn't hear all the stories at once. People were just wanting to talk.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I believe religion is one form of community, but there are so many others. Just like having a local store everybody goes to, or everyone seeing the same newspaper every day. Like that was still a thing.
We don't
When I
have
was
that.
a kid, everyone saw the same headlines and had different opinions about them. But
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
We have too much information coming our way. We can't possibly make sense of it.
Yeah, Cameron, I agree with that besides religion, there are these other sources of community connection that bring people together. And maybe back to your earlier point about the Confederate statues being taken down and Ben Franklin High School being changed. Obviously one source of community and is national identity. I mean, not just community, but
Right.
individual identity. I am an American. And having a shared history. And I think rather than integrating our ancestors with all their strengths and flaws and allowing the statues to remain up and, presenting history in a nuanced way, including the good and the bad, it's like there's been this, movement to kill the parents, so to speak. And then I think people feel like they've got nothing left. They're just totally rootless and flailing around, and they don't even have the label American to apply to themselves.
agree with pretty much everything you just said. And kind of that it's this new utopia where you don't have to look at the mistakes of the past anymore. And we can figure everything out now, how to feel and think about everything.
Well, Lynn's story is really interesting from that respect because those folks could have talked about how their neighborhood was destroyed by the freeway, which has happened in many, many cities. There's a very similar story. But instead of getting into the wound of that, they connected to the story of the past. So there's a good example of how you can look at the
Yeah.
shadow side or the light side of the situation. The injury versus the remembrance or the grieving, perhaps even.
Yeah, and Cameron, I like that, the mistakes of the past, having them be there, not hiding them away, not denying them, but uh, obviously we need them there. We need to be able to learn from them, right? And I just had one other thought, maybe a little bit provocative, but I think this kind of utopian project assumes that, if we were to go back in history, if we were living, in pre-Civil War era, we would not own slaves. But how can we be so sure? How can any one of us here be so sure that we wouldn't have done exactly the same thing that people were doing at that time because that's what was accepted?
Yeah, people tend to collapse history and erase history.
Exactly.
Everybody thinks that they would be the person, to hide the Jews during the Holocaust. But again, how do you know? How can you be so sure?
Well, and America is a really amazing country. It's done a lot of really messed up things, but I mean, I don't know. That was a pretty basic thought, but this is a great country. We shouldn't hate our own country.
We really shouldn't hate I mean, and there are people who hate our country.
Yeah.
The very, very far fringe people. And I think on either side, it's problem. I mean, there is a lot of this is pathology too. There's a lot of people who had no meaning in their life, and they have, I'm talking about the real extreme. Really, they don't really even know, many of them don't even know what they're fighting for. It's almost like belonging to a gang.
Oh.
Because people, again, the decline of community, people don't belong anywhere. And I do believe that in our profession, if we want to keep it alive, these groups are so important now. Because I see this as an existential threat to our profession.
Wow.
Well,
That's a strong statement.
it is what is challenged is self-reflection in general.
Yeah. That's a big problem.
Right.
I mean, isn't that what our work stands on?
Yeah. Well, the other night, I don't know if any of you all watch this thing on PBS called American Masters, and they do biographies of different people. I don't watch it, but my girlfriend Jane messaged me the other night and said they're doing Hannah Arendt. So I said, oh, I'll watch it. Well, it was incredible. It was an incredible biography of her, interviews with her, and films from her earlier life and everything. And so, when she was 18, she goes to college. She has an affair with Heidegger. Heidegger's married. He's 35. He's got 2 boys. They really had a hot affair, and they basically were in love with each other all their lives. So she's Jewish, of course, and he's, I don't know what he was, but he was not Jewish. And when the Nazis come along, he's not just a passive Nazi, he's an active Nazi. He signed documents that were harmful to Jewish students, getting them out of college and all of that, getting them booted out. And of course, and I didn't know that Hannah Arendt had actually been in a concentration camp at one point. I had not heard that part of the story. But she was. She married this guy named Heinrich somebody, and they were, really hot too. But they got separated. He went to a male camp. She went to a female camp. And then she got out, and she ended up, after a whole bunch of troubles, getting to the U.S. and became an American citizen. After the war, and of course, then Heidegger got, after the war was over and all, he went through a lot of troubles for having been a Nazi, had to go through some kind of re-education stuff and all that. So Hannah Arendt goes back to Germany at some point, and she's working on some issues over there, some her history and philosophy and so on. She's over there working, and Heidegger knocks on her hotel door, and she opens the door, and he says, "I have come to turn myself in," and they kind of reignite their relationship after all of this. And so people asked her, how could you, after he was a Nazi and he did all this harm and he caused many people harm, how could you continue? And she helped him translate some of his stuff into English and all that. And she said, well, love and friendship overcomes a whole lot of stuff. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing thing. I did not know that about her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very hopeful story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Lynn. That's really powerful. Love and friendship. And forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to see groups like this with, immigrants and rich white people and people on Medicaid, and just getting to know each other's stories.
Yeah, because you just hear things and your perspective is different from that. You're exposed to more.
Yeah. All we get are isms and stereotypes. And
People who are really afraid to talk.
yeah. Any closing comments, anyone? Where we are?
Just a thank you. I'm very grateful for having this opportunity. Especially, I think it's very valuable and more people should do it. As one person living in this crazy world and having this opportunity, I found it really helpful.
Yeah, I echo that. Thank you, all of you. Sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I feel like we're still being nice, but we're learning more things of difference.
Has to go at its pace. Like, I don't think you can rush it.
Right.
Well, it seemed important to me that we talked about the things we talked about today, America, national identity, given that the 4th is just around the corner. So I hope all of you have a lovely 4th of July celebration.
Yeah.
It's going to be
Oh, did you just raise a flag, Lynn?
I just did that.
Oh.
Okay, I thought I saw a flag go up or something.
Very good. All right, let's email in between. I kind of like the meetings alternating with emails. Written and in person, back and forth seems to be useful. And let's take it from here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.